if you look at parallel comparative history between China and Tibet, because that is where the claim from China is, right? That's why we have to argue against it. Now, there are stories that the first king of Tibet came from India, Prince Rupati. So there are stories, and there are also different versions of the first king of Tibet having come from Tibet, other parts of Tibet as well. But there were two stories of the first king of Tibet, Nyati Tsembo, having come from India. So that is how old our relationship is, more than 2,200, 2,300 years ago. Then the more well-known stories start from 7th century. That is when the Tibetan script was invented by Tribisambuddha from India. And then 8th century, when Tibetan Buddhism came into Tibet during Chisung Tezen's time, Shantarakshita, Padmasambhava, Kamalashila, all these were masters who were responsible for setting up Buddhist institutions inside Tibet. And then the Tibetans transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan language from 9th to 13th century, or maybe from 8th to 13th century. So at one time, Tibet must have had the biggest transliteration house in the world, because we transliterate every available text. So even today, the reason why His Holiness says Tibetan language is very important is because Tibetan language is the only language that has all the teachings of the Buddha in its pristine sense. So today, we are translating it back into Sanskrit, from Tibetan to Sanskrit. It's quite easy, not that difficult, because originally it was translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan. Right? And we are very proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom by having all this text in Tibet. Then 9th to 13th century, Tibet disintegrated. There was not one single ruler who could rule the whole of Tibet. And there was another story which I've been saying lately. 2 years ago, I think, when I visited this area, or maybe the other side, then I found that in 1206, in the beginning of 13th century, when Genghis Khan's power was really growing in Asia, India was ruled by the Khiljis, right? Khiljis. They ruled Delhi, then they came up to Kolkata, and they ruled this area. And Bakhtiyar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet in 1206. That was the beginning of 13th century. And that was almost at the end of the 400 years of disintegration of Tibet, where you would assume that Tibet must have been very weak. But in 1206, when Bakhtiyar Khilji sent 10,000 army into Tibet, only 100 returned back. I'm not saying the Tibetans killed all the Khilji army. They may have been Palas and other kingdoms in that region on their way while retreating back to Calcutta. They must have also taken advantage of the situation. But that also proves that even after 400 years of disintegration, the frontier Tibet that borders with other countries are still very strong in defending themselves. If it is not for the Tibetans who are on the border to be able to stop Khilji's army, I'm sure, or maybe it's very much probable that Buddhism would not remain in Tibet. Because the Khiljis were also responsible for destroying Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Othantapuri and these Buddhist monasteries. Right? And then, but during those 400 years when Tibet historically, politically was not very powerful, but many Tibetan masters came to India to study Buddhism. They went back like Losao Mapa, who was the founder of the Kagyu tradition. He came to India 3 times. You can imagine having to walk from all the way from Tibet over these mountains, down valleys, into India, learn from the Indian masters, bring all the valuables from Tibet, offer it to the masters of Nalanda, and then go back to Tibet and preach it back there. Right? So that's how it happened. Then the Tibetans built relations with the Mongols in 1247. in the middle of 13th century with Kublai Khan's father. And we already had what is called as priest-patron relationship with the Mongols in the beginning or mid 13th century when Sakya Pandita Kungo Kyanzen built this relation with Kublai Khan's father. And later, in 1271, Kublai Khan invaded China. Then it became the Yuan dynasty, what they call as Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N. Right? So, the Mongols ruled China, not Chinese, the Mongols, right? Mongols invaded China, they ruled China from 1271 to 1368. And during that period, Tibetans were ruled by the Sakyapas, and they established what is called as the Panchen administrative system in Tibet. Then in China, 1368, the Mongols, or the Yuans, were overthrown by the Mings. The Mings are real Han Chinese. And they ruled China from 1368 to 1644, for almost 300 years. And during that period, Tibet was ruled by by the three dynasties of Pomodoro dynasty, Rinpoche dynasty, and Devasamba dynasty for about 300 years. Right? So you see this comparative history. In 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama took over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet 2 years before the Mings were overthrown by the Qings. The Mings are real Han Chinese, but the Qings are not Chinese, they are Manchus. If you watch Kung Fu movies, Kung Fu movies, if you watch Kung Fu movies, don't just watch Kung Fu, look at the story also. Most of the heroes are Chinese. Almost all the heroes are Chinese. All the Dakus are Manchus in the Chinese movies, Kung Fu movies. There also you can see the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that the Manchus are not Chinese. Right? They ruled from 1644 to 1911. But 2 years before that, successive Dalai Lamas from 1642 ruled Tibet. Then the India was ruled by the Britishers, and Britishers started coming into Tibet in 1903, 1904, in what is now called as the Young Husband Expedition into Tibet. So they came up to Lhasa, and they made a deal with the Tibetan government to establish trading posts, and they have the right to come up to Shigaze, or the Gyangze. Then the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia. And then later, the 13th Dalai Lama was in China in 1908. Right? But when the Britishers came, where were the Chinese? Because China says that Tibet was part of China since ancient times. Right? So when the Britishers came up to Lhasa, where were the Chinese to defend Tibet? There were no Chinese. Then His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama had to come back to Tibet in 1908 end, and then 1909 end His Holiness reached Lhasa. 3 years, three months after that, the Chinese started coming from eastern Tibet in 1910. And then the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to India. Here in Darjeeling, the 13th Dalai Lama met with Lord Curzon in Kolkata those days, and then lived most of his time in Darjeeling and Kalimpong area. Right? And then in 1912, every single Chinese were kicked out of Tibet. Because 1911, there was a downfall of the Qing dynasty, and the nationalist movement came in China. And there was no reinforcement for them to come back. All the Chinese army in Tibet were kicked out. But we didn't send them from Kham or Amdo, from the east. We sent them through India. So they came to Kalimpong, Darjeeling, all that, and 1962 war, many of them were moved to Calcutta. So not all the Chinese people in Calcutta are those who were sent from Tibet. There were many traders also. Right? Tingsang Calcutta the Japanese Humuduwa. Lukhachi, Lupawa, and Lupurma, Bigo the Chare, Yana Pama Lopse, or Duche, Luchin Yori. Then, 19 Then His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama returned back to Tibet in 1912, and then there was a signing of agreement between the Mongols and the Tibetans, both declaring to be independent states. And then in 1914, there was the signing of the Shimla Agreement, which defines the border, what is now called as the McMahon Line. McMahon Line was signed between British India and Tibet, independent Tibet, when Tibet was independent. So even today, in the Arunachal Pradesh, McMahon Line is the defining boundary. And then in the Ladakh sector also, McMahon Line is the one that decides the boundary between India and Tibet. So today, of course, international media, they call it Indo-China border, right? But the Indian government has still not changed the name from Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Indo-Tibetan Border Force. They've still kept it Indo-Tibetan, not Indo-China. So that also underlies India's position on Tibet and the boundary issue. So if McMahon is the border, then there should be recognition for Tibet's independent status also, because we were signatory to that agreement. Although in 1914, now many Indian historians or many Indian experts or so-called experts would like to say, oh, Tibet became independent from 1913 onwards. No, Tibet was an independent country. The 1913 was a reiteration of Tibet's independence by the 13th Dalai Lama. So it was not a new declaration of Tibet's independence. Tibet was independent, but it was more a reiteration of Tibet's independence in the past. Then China was China, Tibet was Tibet, we were independent. Then 1949, Communist Kuomintang, and the Kuomintangs are communists and the Kuomintangs are nationalists. So they had civil war, nationalists lost, and they moved to Taiwan, and then China was ruled by the communists. In 1949, they established the communist government in China, and 1950, they invaded Tibet from the east in Chamdo. And then 1951, we were forced to sign this 17-point agreement. And we tried to live under that agreement for 8 years, but Chinese trampled on all the provisions of the agreement, and then His Holiness was forced to flee to exile in 1959. Okay? It's not because we didn't have enough food to eat in Tibet and we came to India. That is because of China's brute force that forced us to go out of Tibet. And today, Tibet's situation has much to do with India's security. If Tibet is secure, if Tibet is safe, then India is also secure. If Tibet is not safe, India is not secure. That is why you have all the problems in Doklam, right? In Tawang, in Ladakh. Just 3 weeks ago, there was the BRICS conference in Kazan, in Russia, and the Indian Prime Minister Modi ji and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat across the table. After 5 years, they are back on the negotiating table, and India's position has become much more stronger than before, because India says that if there is no disengagement at all the sectors, there won't be normalization of relations. And now China says that they will disengage and they would be joint patrolling of Demchok and Depsang borders, and the disengagement presumably has started, but it has a lot of delays to that. We still have to see whether the status quo will go back to 2020 April 2020 ante before that. So if it goes back, then you can trust China maybe a little bit right now, but China cannot be trusted, so we'll have to watch the developments. I hope that gives you a broad picture of how Tibet was invited, and how we come to be in exile.